Welcome to the show today. Today, we're going to talk about something that trips up a lot of fruit tree growers, and it's fertilizing and watering. And those things are often treated like two separate jobs. But inside the tree, they may actually be connected. So, my question is, what does happen when you water your tree? And how does it affect whether your tree can access nutrients or minerals in the soil? To help us understand this, I'm going to be chatting with Casey Clapp. And Casey is an arborist, an author, he's an educator, and completely arbitrary. Casey, I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. I'm very happy to be talking with you.
So, what is actually happening when we are watering our fruit trees?
It's the beginning of a really kind of complicated story that can be simplified as that atmosphere tree soil continuum. And it's all filled with water to some degree. There's air filled with water around us. The tree itself has water in it, and then there's soil water in the ground as well. What a tree is doing is they're not really, we have basically one intake place, and we just put all of our food and water into there, and our body sort systems, one is up in the air through the leaves and the other is down in the ground where the roots are. The leaves are what are making the actual food of the plant. That's photosynthesis, creating sugars out of water, carbon dioxide. So in order to make that, they will have to take in the carbon dioxide from the air. They have to get the water down from the ground where their roots are. But the water is also a vessel for all these kind of nutrients that the tree needs as well. They can't get everything from the air. You're not going to get manganese or calcium or any of those other nutrients, those other elements, molecules in the soil. You can't get that from the air. So trees end up taking all that in as a dissolved mineral inside of the water that they get around them. And of course, they also have their fungal associates, their different fungal bodies that are in the ground. Those are doing a lot of that work too, where they've made this evolutionary this evolutionary bargain to be symbiotes with each other. So the fungus says, hey, what if I give you all this delicious water filled with all these nutrients, and you give me a little bit of your sugar? What do you think about that? And the tree says, yeah, that sounds wonderful. That's a great deal. So ultimately, these fungus are attached to the roots. Those roots are foraging for all these nutrients and water underground. Then they absorb that through osmosis. Basically, it just kind of sucks in a little bit of water into their cells, and then that gets pulled up through the stem via that continuum into the air. And then, just like a straw, the air is pulling a teeny bit of one molecule of water out of those leaves during photosynthesis. And then that's kind of like a chain connected through a series of tubes all the way down into the water in the ground. So ultimately, what's happening when you water your plants is you are allowing it to dissolve these nutrients that then get absorbed into the roots, that then gets pulled up like a straw out to the leaves and to the rest of the tree.
So first of all, in the soil, it's like the vitamin cabinet, right? It's
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
all the good, healthy stuff the trees needs. It's got its minerals in there that it definitely needs. It can't make its own minerals.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if there's no water in the soil, even if it has fungal friends down there attached to it, let's say there's zero water in the soil, there's a
Mm.
drought, can it access those minerals?
Not really. No, because there's no real mechanism for that to happen. The water is that vessel that's pulling things from the soil either right into the roots or through that fungal associate, through that micro or that mycological network. So if there's no water, then the trees, well, they don't have any water, and that's wildly important for keeping pressures up, keeping leaves at full staff, that kind of thing. But then also, you don't have any way to pull up those nutrients. So as soon as a drought hits and there's zero water, that is absolutely the worst possible thing for a tree. Often they can live for a little bit with too much water, but then once you bring that down to zero, they're really struggling. It's just like humans. We could go without eating for 2 or 3 weeks, they say, but we could only last for 3 days without drinking water.
Earlier in our conversation, Casey explained that even a young seedling starts out looking for water in the soil, but water isn't the whole story. From the moment the seedling sort of gets into the soil or starts to sprout in the soil, it's looking for water. That makes
Hmm.
sense. but it's looking for friends. It's looking for fungal friends.
You'll find me giving a lot of agency to plants and animals and fungi. I recently read the book The Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger, and I highly recommend everyone read that because she kind of covers the cutting edge of plant science and behavior. And one of the things that she does is basically say, well, plants are actually like making a lot of decisions in a traditional kind of way. So as we are looking close at a little tiny seedling, without too much kind of hyperbole, it is a foraging like organ, the roots, the whole root system in and of itself. So as soon as it hits that soil, it has the different chemical hormones that basically give it what's called gravitropism, which just means that the roots want to grow down. So they have these little chemicals that say grow down, and as you grow down, we're going to find a little bit of water because inevitably, whenever these little seeds are sprouting, they either know we have to grow really deep to get the water, adapted to dry conditions or something like that, or they grow during the springtime when there tends to be a lot of water in the soil that's actively available, so not frozen or something like that. So once that root goes down, it's looking for the teeny tiny little molecules of water that are far smaller than what you and I would normally see, but they are finding those tiny little pockets, suck up a little bit of water there. Then there's inevitably some tiny filaments of fungus in the soil as well. That fungus will send a little filament, and as soon as it touches the root, they're both basically looking for each other because the fungus wants to everything else. The way that I usually describe it is that a tree root could be the size of your pinky finger, while the filaments of a fungus, that mycelial network, that's about the size of your hair. So it can go way further, way deeper, get into the teeny tiniest little cracks, break out those little bits of water, and make a tree far more efficient at actually foraging for these nutrients in the water that stores them. So as soon as they find each other, they immediately start this kind of chemical reaction where they say, "Oh, you're a friend, you're a buddy. Okay, cool." And then they end up connecting, sometimes in the cell, sometimes it's just a sheath around the tree's cells. And then they start to just share these different molecules of water and sugars and all these little agreements that they made millions of years ago. And as soon as they find that little network, they're then tapped into all the other trees around them as well. Literally, the benefit of the whole is the benefit of me personally, and trees know that.
That is such a beautiful story. Like um friendship,
Yeah.
cooperation, working together. It's not like me, I want the water myself. It's like, hey guys, let's work together
Yeah.
and make some friends in the soil who will also help us out.
Hmm.
So, from what I understand, you've got a young tree, it's got new tender little roots and they're reaching out. Over time, those roots will become, more rigid,
Hmm.
and but they keep moving out further and further. And so traditionally when you are growing fruit trees, you're looking to water the trees around the edge of the canopy because from what I understand, those feeder roots that take in the water and the nutrients is at the edge of the canopy. Does that mean the fungal friends are also in the same location? Does everybody abandon the woody roots in the middle and say, hey guys, let's keep moving outwards where all the action is?
Yeah, well, the fungus will be growing underneath. They kind of will grow out wherever there happens to be anything that they are looking for, these kind of foraging fungal filaments. But it's the tiny root hairs on the larger roots that are attached to the larger roots. Those are the ones that are doing all the actual absorption. In that one area near the drip line of the canopy, you tend to find more roots growing out because there's this area that arborists call the zone of rapid oh gosh, it's the zone of rapid taper. And it's essentially where you have big roots connected to the stem that then split off and become much smaller roots as it goes out. And usually, depending on the size of the tree, it about represents the drip line, that edge of the canopy. So it's not 100% perfect, but it's a good proxy to say, well, where are the roots that are doing the nutrient and water uptake versus the roots that are mostly now acting as these structural conduits. So the fungus and these tiny root hairs, they'll be growing back into that area. If there's nutrients there, if there's water there, they'll definitely be going in. But it's those large roots that have already grown out, and those are kind of the big freeways connecting everything.
Yeah, so you see it a lot, and I did it myself when we first planted our fruit trees, where people will go, I'm going to water my tree, and they'll take a watering can and they'll water right around the trunk.
Yeah.
And maybe if it's a young tree, the roots are there, but the older the tree is, the bigger the tree is, it's like, I'm not sure you're getting the right spot here. Move
Yeah.
outwards. So yeah, I just remember, Casey, that when I years and years ago, when I first started growing fruit trees in our orchard park, in our community orchard, and I went to all the trouble to organize a workshop and bring people in, and got a teacher to teach us. And because we had all these people and we didn't have an irrigation system yet, we just got everybody to haul buckets of water and water the
Yeah,
trees with
definitely.
us. Like, come on, give us some labor here. And so I'm watering the tree, and some meanie comes up to me and says, "You're watering that tree wrong." And I'm thinking, how can you possibly water a tree wrong? And
Mhm.
turns out I was, because I was watering right near the trunk. Okay, so never mind. So back to how we are taking in, so the tree is taking in water.
Mhm.
And you talked about that little teeny tiny seedling that just is establishing itself. Now, in an earlier conversation, you talked to me about sort of like a straw forming in that little seedling.
Mhm.
What is that straw called, and how do they multiply so that they can support a bigger tree and a bigger tree and a bigger tree?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in angiosperms, so in the apple trees, all the flowering trees, most everything you'll be working with in an orchard, those have vessels, and we also call those pores. And so if you cut a an oak tree down, or you cut any tree that is well, just basically any tree really, if you cut cross section across that stem, you'll see little vertical holes. They look like little circles, and not the rings around the tree, but inside each of those rings are these tiny little circles. Those are just the edges of these tubes. These are vessels in the angiosperms, and those are the flowering trees. And in the conifers, or in the gymnosperms, they're called tracheids. And both of those together, they're kind of functionally doing the same thing, but they're different evolved kind of structures if you go way down into the anatomy of the wood. But for all intents and purposes, the way that they are built is every year when a new tree puts on a, or every year when a tree, an old tree puts on a new ring, then it adds more of these vessels or tracheids, depending, of course, if it's a conifer or a broadleaf tree. But we'll talk just about the vessels because there's not many orchard trees that are gymnosperms or are conifers. So what happens is you get every year a new ring of what we call xylem. And xylem is essentially the cells that become the wood. And that is in contrast to the phloem. Those are the cells that get pushed out towards the inner bark. And those are the cells, the phloem, that take the different photosynthetic sugars that are produced in the leaves, and they distribute that down through the rest of the tree. I think about this as it flows down. The phloem flows down. Versus the xylem, that's actually the Greek word for wood way back when. So things like xylophone just means it's a wooden maker of sound, that kind of thing. So as soon as that new ring is put on, you get a new layer of these vessels. And there's only maybe 3 to 5 years on most plants of those that are actually living, and we call that sapwood. And that's because there's sap going on. It's moving things up and down. There's little tubes that are all either vertically oriented or they're right next to each other. And you can imagine them like straws that have openings on the top and the bottom, but they're also perforated along the edges. And they're all perfectly nested next to each other. So there's never going to be some space in between. You always have a little tube connected to another little tube, both left and right and up and down. Then, as that tree's moving water, the water fills up and goes through all those little tubes and all the little holes, and it becomes this kind of vertically oriented system of transfer, like a bunch of tubes that are all moving together. But because there's different layers, they're kind of backups for each other. In case something happens in one, the water can go around it on the ones that are to the left and to the right, that kind of thing. And then if you want to really get into the anatomy, you can look at things like diffuse porous trees and ring porous trees and learn all about kind of how the tree builds different sizes and shapes and lengths of these in order to be more efficient at different times of the year or in different places where they're adapted to different water regimes overall, like say at high elevations or in the deserts of the world versus some place that has a lot of water like a rainforest or something like that.
So the xylem and phloem, we find it in the living tissue that's just underneath the bark. Am I
Correct. Yeah.
correct? So,
Hmm.
so for instance, if you are out there pruning an apple tree and let's say you're shortening a branch and you can actually see this light green tissue under the
Yeah.
bark and then inside you see more woody stuff. So
Hmm.
that's where all the action is. That's the living tissue. And I love how you talk about the xylem is bringing stuff up. So it's bringing those vitamins, those nutrients, those minerals from the soil, bringing it up all the way through the tree. So everybody gets what they need. And the phloem is then, once the photosynthesis has happened and all the delicious, yummy nutrients have been created from photosynthesis, the phloem is bringing it down back.
Yeah.
And as now, this is the interesting part because we're talking about the relationship between kind of fertilizing, which we'll get to at some
Uh-huh.
point, and sort of like taking in the liquid. So when it's coming down, is the tree consuming and using, like from what I understand, and I may be wrong, when it's coming down, there are uses for that nutrients from
Hmm.
photosynthesis. It's being used, but extra is coming down, 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 down into the roots where it's going to be stored in a little pantry for the winter.
Yeah.
And some is going to spill out into the soil and feed our friendly fungal associates in the soil. And
That's
so
exactly right.
isn't that sweet? Like it is sweet because it is
It
sweet
is.
nutrients, right, from photosynthesis. But like the tree is enjoying, it's made its own food. Thanks to those little fungal beings in the soil, it's been able to take in lots of yummy, well, I don't know if it's yummy, but lots of healthy minerals. It's made no nutrition in itself. It's made its own food. It's using it, it's storing some, and it's spilling the rest into the soil to feed its friends. And then the cycle goes round and round.
Hmm.
So cool.
Yeah,
No?
right. It is. It's really, truly incredible.
One of the other things that I personally love so much about fruit trees is again, some of that sweet, well, some of the sugars it's producing, it then puts into the fruit. Now, I know it's not making fruit with me in mind, thinking Susan's hungry, she wants a delicious apple or a peach. But all those sugars will, if the tree is well nourished enough, if this all this cycle is working in a really good way, it's stashing away so much great nutrition in the fruit itself.
Hmm.
So what a generous, generous being these fruit trees are. I mean, I love all trees, but I do love fruit trees.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
see, I might
Hmm.
actually, I might actually say that I think the tree does know that Susan is hungry and does want to eat this peach, because trees making that agreement with animals, that's them basically saying, okay, well, what if I give you this? Then would you take my seed? And then they do, and they take their seed and plant it. So like I said, about giving trees a lot of agency, I love the idea that a tree is almost co-opting you, where when we think we're in control, all of a sudden, if you flip that script and say the tree is offering you this beautiful apple, you're like, well, I can't resist that. So the tree and you are in this evolutionary bargain.
And how many people do you know that have taken an avocado seed and sprouted it and turned it into
Yes,
a plant? They fell for it. They
totally.
fell
It's
for it.
exactly
They're
right.
helping propagate this beautiful creature.
Yeah, Michael
Um,
Pollan has a great book about that. It's called The Botany of Desire. If you ever have the opportunity to read that, my goodness, does he flip the script on everything from weed and like how does it affect our mind to potatoes and corn? It's really just one of my favorite books.
oh, fantastic. Oh, so many new books for me to read.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've got the cycle of water and nutrition. We've got the straws or the xylem and phloem that's going up and down into the trees. So now what happens? We understand that when you're watering just with water,
Hmm.
that goes into the tree. Now, here's an interesting thing. A lot of commercial fertilizers are liquid,
Yeah.
right? So you don't even have to have your own water. You just pour, sometimes there's nutrient spikes. I hate those. They're terrible.
Mm,
I'm not a big fan of fertilizing fruit trees unless I know they need it.
yeah.
I will, the way I fertilize our fruit trees is in the spring, we spread out compost in the mulch circle that will break down over time. It's all natural. The organisms in the soil will take, process the nutrition in there and bring it into the tree. But
Yeah.
if you were to take, from what I understand, if you take commercial fertilizer and give it to the tree, pour it around the roots and whatever, what happens then? How does that affect this whole system?
Yeah. First off, I need to note that your version of adding fertilizer is so much better than anything else. It's the same as any other nutrient in the soil, which is why often if you put too much fertilizer, it'll stress the tree. It'll get like that fertilizer burn. That's because you're putting on these really intensely concentrated amounts of chemicals right on the soil, right on the roots sometimes. Sometimes if you do it poorly on the actual leaves and the stem of the plant. And then that's not really going into the plant because everything that the plant uptakes, other than a little bit of water, a little bit of oxygen and carbon dioxide, that is all going through the roots. So if you water then on top of that, it reduces the concentration and then it brings it down into the soil where the roots can take it up into the rest of the tree. So for fertilizer, another thing you noted, which is really important, is it should only be used if there is a deficit in the soil. A lot of fly-by-night companies will say, "Oh, your tree's not doing so well. Well, let's just give it some fertilizer." And often that actually doesn't solve any problems. It can make them worse because you don't know what's actually wrong. It's like giving out too many antibiotics because someone has a cold or something else, and it's just kind of this, well, let's just throw it at it and see if it works. It's like, well, actually, you're not solving any problem because you don't know what the problem is. So you should always get a soils test to say, it looks like this macronutrient or this particular different thing is really in a deficit in the soil. Then you can add that in. But you can also do things like what you're talking about, add in the compost that will add that in over a longer period of time. So making sure you know what is lacking before you add in that fertilizer, you might get a really nice big green flush because there's a lot more phosphorus. Then the tree's like, wow, I'm really happy, but trees are really big. So if you add a certain amount of fertilizer, they're going to use it up just like that. You have to make sure that it's either a long-term process, but you also are not fixing the ecosystem. And that's something I always recommend.
Just two more main questions for you. And one is going to complicate things. Maybe you'll be mad at me. I don't
Okay,
know.
let's go for it.
Okay, we talked about the roots taking in water, leaves. The leaves also take in a little water. The
They
reason I
do,
know
yeah.
this is we do holistic sprays and we spray the leaves of our trees. Something gets in.
Mhm.
So, how does that relate to this whole system?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a reasonable aspect, but not a gigantic, huge part of it. And we actually just covered this on my podcast, Completely Arbortrary, when we talked about the coast redwoods, those 350 or more foot tall trees, so well past 100 meters. Those trees are taking all of their water from the soil, but they wouldn't be able to survive along the Californian coast on just that alone. So what happens is they grow in what's called the fog belt. And this is this beautiful area of Northern California and Southern Oregon that gets a ridiculous amount of heavy fog in the summertime. Coincidentally, during the same time over here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a very nice prolonged drought. So everyone thinks, oh, you're from the Pacific Northwest. It rains there all the time. Yes, that's true, but only from about, I don't know, September through May. Once you get to June, July, and August, things start to dry up and there's almost no rain for weeks at a time. So those big trees on the coast, they end up taking in a lot of their water through their foliage called foliar uptake. And it's not a percentage that is like, wow, this tree could live without any roots like some plants down in the tropics or something like that. Nothing actually in the soil. But what they do is they slowly take it in through their leaves. And there's some leaves on redwoods, for example, that are modified and they basically lay down like scale like leaves along the edge of the twigs, and then they are more specialized to take in water. So those little pores inside the leaves are called stomata. That's what lets different carbon dioxide and oxygen out when trees are either doing photosynthesis or respiring, like you and I breathing. But then they'll also every now and then suck up just a little bit of water. And it often has to do with those pressure deficits we were talking about, and that osmosis kind of idea, where if there is more water in the atmosphere, because, well, let's say you're covered in fog, then there is less water inside the leaf, then that deficit of pressure and the deficit of having water in one place but not in the other will pull that water into the leaf. So the trees will often reverse their whole flows and pull more water from their leaves down into the soil. This actually happens often from the soil deep spaces going up into lower spaces, which is why trees are so important in a lot of areas. They'll actually pull deep water up and help give that out to the soil for plants that don't have as deep roots. So it's very likely that with any amount of with any trees or any amount of foliar spray, that depending on the conditions, if there's more water in the soil, probably not necessary. But as soon as the water in the soil starts to be reduced, then it's more likely that you'll have this reverse of pressure and this reverse of concentrations that ends up letting the tree take in a little bit of water from the leaves. So it's an adaptation that many plants have, but the percentages are like 90% of the water comes from the ground most of the time, and then a smaller percentage comes from the leaves only when the trees are really finding themselves stressed.
Yeah, for people who have listened to an earlier episode of this podcast, we did a great show with John Kempf, who talks about using holistic sprays on the leaves and getting in these nutrients really quickly. And we've
Yeah.
done it. You see such a fast reaction of the leaves going greener within literally hours. You see the difference. It's quite amazing.
Amazing.
So to me, that was evidence that yes, they do take in liquids through their leaves, but
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is very true that it's a teeny tiny amount. And here's what's kind of weird and funny is that one of the earliest lessons I learned is when you are irrigating a fruit tree, an apple tree, cherry tree, whatever, don't use a sprinkler. So the first
Okay.
thing that I understood was, okay, don't use a sprinkler because a lot of water is wasted. B, you need to focus the water under the on the soil, under
Yeah.
the edge of the canopy where the feeder roots are and all that good stuff. C, when you're watering the whole tree, the trunk, the branches, and whatever, the problem is that the canopy gets wet and it may stay wet. Often it
Mm,
will, especially if you're not pruning your tree correctly. And then you get not the good kinds of fungus, the bad kind of fungus that is
yeah.
fungal diseases.
Yeah.
So we really try to avoid watering with a sprinkler. So it's kind of a little twist because we will spray the trees in the right time with the right spray mixture. If people have rainwater, it's fantastic rather than,
Hmm.
tap water, and you can put things in and people can learn from that episode. But sprinklers aren't the way to go. So, practical takeaways from this show is we know how critical water is for fruit trees. But the question people will always ask me, and I'm going to ask you just to put you on the spot, Casey.
Okay.
Okay, how much water does my fruit tree need? And how do I know how much to water my fruit tree?
Man, that is such an important question. And it's one that I have gotten for years and years living out here in the West. We often plant trees. Historically, we used to plant them all in April next month because that's Arbor Day. That's when we celebrate all things trees and earth, right? But then we have this big long summer drought, like just a month and a half away, where a lot of our trees would really struggle. So conventionally, we'd say, well, plant them in the fall. That way, they have essentially 9 months worth of time to establish their roots and get a little bit deeper and get a little bit more acclimated to their new home. And but then the summertime would still come and we would always have to deal with that extended drought. So the thing that I have always said is generally I like the lo-fi kind of solutions, but there are bags that go on the edge of small trees, those little gator bags that you can plant or put around a newly planted tree and they'll water very slowly over time. But then the nonprofit here in Portland called Friends of Trees, they developed this wonderful thing. I don't know if they did it themselves, but they have lots of videos to show homeowners where they say, you don't need to go buy a bag. You probably have a 5 gallon bucket laying around. Drill some 3/8 inch, some not even 3/8, it's even smaller than that, some really tiny little holes in the bottom. Fill those up and set two or three around your tree. Generally, with small trees, it's more important because they're still establishing themselves. As those buckets slowly drain, they go into the soil at a very slow rate. And the slow rate's really important because you don't want to wash away or have erosion on top. And also the soil can only absorb a certain amount of water in a certain amount of time. So as that water goes down, you want to generally have the top 6 or so inches of soil moist, but not absolutely muddy where you reach your finger in and you're like, wow, I can make some clay pots out of this, or I can throw it at my friends. You want it to be just moist enough where if you dig in, it's not very hard. You can use your hand, you can scratch down a couple inches, and you can say, yeah, there's dark soil there that is moist. Once that happens, let it sit for a little bit, then come back the next week. If it's really hot, 80 or 100 degrees, I think it's what, 34 degrees in Celsius. When it gets really, really hot, then you might do that twice a week. But for the most part, doing it just about once a week with 15 or so gallons should be enough, especially for a small tree. And you want that water to drain down, to start to dry out just on the top. So if you dig your fingers down and you have about 2 or so inches that's dry, then you need to start again. And then let that water move through, kind of dry out, let it move through, let it dry out, and do that, once is generally enough a week. Every now and then, if it's not too hot, you can go every 2 weeks. If it's way too hot, then add in a second bucket here and there to give it just a little bit of extra water. But once a tree becomes large and established, its roots are generally deep enough that it's finding the water that's kind of stabilized a couple feet down. Usually, roots are in the top 2 to 3 feet of soil. So, generally, it's going to be okay if you can get an established tree. So, after 10 or 15 years, you probably don't need to water it almost at all. But if you did, I would still put down the compost like what you described earlier, put a layer of mulch over the top of that. And then in the depth of summertime, when it's really hot, put maybe 4 or 5 buckets out there and fill that up every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even once a month, just to make sure the tree has no conception of stress. That way it will be doing exactly what it is you're trying to get it to do, i.e. produce a lot of delicious fruit.
It's so funny that you said that. I call that the leaky bucket technique, and I
Yeah,
put
there you
it,
go.
I love it. I put it in my first book that I wrote, I think in 2014 or something,
Perfect.
because what's beautiful about that technique is with the little gator bags, they're so little, they're great for newly planted trees. But as your tree gets bigger, you just have to throw them out to use them with because
Yeah.
as we were talking about, those feeder roots are moving outwards and outwards. But the great thing about these leaky buckets is you can move them out as the tree gets older and
Mm-hmm.
you can set up the buckets, you fill them with water, go do your weeding somewhere else. And the other thing that I like about that is what people don't realize. Sometimes people plant their fruit tree in the corner of their garden,
Mm-hmm.
and they can't get at the roots on their neighbor's side. So they water the
Yeah.
roots on one side of the tree,
Mm-hmm.
not realizing that the roots on the other side may not get that benefit. They may die off because who knows if the neighbor is watering your tree's roots? They might not
Yeah.
have thought about that,
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I love the leaky bucket technique. It's great if you have one or two trees. If you've got a whole orchard, you'll need some, drip irrigation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the big takeaway is water is really important.
Yeah.
And especially with our climate, the way things are changing, sometimes you get lots of water and then sometimes you get nothing for a long time.
That's right.
So, so as we wrap up, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think, oh my goodness, the Orchard People listeners need to know this about trees, about watering, all sorts of stuff?
Yeah, well, first off, everyone should be planting a tree, no matter what. I think at this moment, both in kind of the political state of the world as well as the climate state of the world, if we can plant a tree, that's our best possible way to fight everything and make the world better for future generations. I don't care what kind of tree it is, just plant a tree, plant a bunch of trees, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Unless it's really a bad, horrible spot for a tree, yeah, you don't plant a tree there, but if everybody in the United States and Canada went out and planted one tree right now, that would be outstanding and we'd really help ourselves out. So, first off, plant trees. Number two, I should have said this all disclosures, but I have never been a fan of apples. So if someone listens to my episode right now on your podcast and then looks up and realizes that guy has had literally hours of rants about apple trees, I am recovering. So I just have to say that. but it is always fun to talk about apples and different orchards and things. My co-host on Completely Arbortrary loves a fruit tree. He's a big fan of fruit trees, always rates them very high. And I am a fan of the big workhorse conifers trees where I'm like, look at that gigantic, huge pine over there, something like that. So I just want to say I'm very glad that you let me talk about fruit trees without any prejudice saying that guy's against apple trees. We can't have him on this episode.
Casey, I listened to that episode.
You did. Oh my God.
I listened to that episode and I laughed because you know what? You are right. I'll tell you why you're right. When an apple tree is planted and is not cared for, it is not a good thing.
Yeah.
But we're going to convert you
Okay.
because
I
I'm
would
going
love to be.
to get you to read my books and realize that
Got it right there.
yeah, with special care, those trees can give us so much. And especially what you're talking about, for sustainability in the world, we need to all be growing our own food. And trees are so generous. Fruit trees are so generous.
Absolutely.
We're going to convert you. And one day you will do a special episode, Why I Now Love You on my show.
Thank you so much, Susan. That means so much.
So, okay, well, Casey, thank you so much. Now, how can people find your show, which is so much fun? If you love trees and if you love learning to identify trees, and if you love trees, as love,
Yeah.
just you love trees, you got to listen to this show. It's a lot of fun. How can people find it? And also tell us about your book.
Yeah, so you can find Completely Arbortrary, and that is the pun, which is arbortrary. So Google, I think, should correct it now, which has been a wild thing to just search my name and have Google say, "Did you mean completely arbitrary?" rather than correcting it to arbitrary. But if you just give that a search on whatever search engine you prefer or in whatever podcast app, we're there. We're also on YouTube. So we put out one episode a week. And actually, this will be our last new episode because I'm taking a big hiatus. And that hiatus is going to be taking me across the United States to find every species of conifer that we have. It's kind of my a multimedia project to try to bring awareness to all these amazing trees and ecosystems that we have in North America, as well as being able to go kind of do a really deep dive on each one of these trees. And of course, I've been doing one podcast a week for 5 years now, and I kind of need a break to say, hey, I'm going to go work on a second project, and then we'll come back and get back into the new episodes. But we'll have an entire year of tree runs starting in about a week and a half, I think. Um,
Wow.
but I wrote this book, The Trees Around You. It's all about how to identify your common neighborhood trees in the Pacific Northwest, which, 50% of the trees in here are also everywhere else in North America. But it is essentially my love letter to identifying trees and why I think it's important, how to do it. I have a phenology calendar in there so you can look through and see which trees are blooming at which times. Anything that there has to do with why trees are interesting and how to identify them, I got in this book. So you can find that. It's The Trees Around You. And you can follow me in my big year of the cone. That's clap with two P's, the number 4 and trees. I'm all over all the social medias for better or worse, but also have a Substack and a Patreon. And I think that's it for what I'm getting up to right now. It's pretty much the book, the podcast, and this big year of the cone, living out in my truck, driving across the country.
That is so exciting. And we'll put the links to everything in the show notes so that people can follow you, support you, and help you on the adventure. And we know that we will all be better educated when you come back and you're going to teach us more about conifers. I love learning about conifers now. They're so new to me. So thank you, Casey, for coming on the show. I hope you had fun. I certainly did.
We made this happen and that we got to have such a fun conversation. It was really a delight to talk to you.
Well, who cannot have fun talking about trees? But anyways,
I can't think of anyone.
so thank you so much to the listeners for tuning into the show today. We're going to have a full article and we're going to summarize this show in the article. So you will be able to check that out when we launch the show. So if you want to learn more about fruit trees, please sign up at orchardpeople.com, get on my newsletter, and I will tell you what's going on. And if you have a fruit tree question, you can always reply to my newsletter and it will come straight to me so I can help you. But that's all for now. I hope you will tune in again sometime whenever we have our next show. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.